Hello, everybody. Welcome to Artblog Radio. I am Roberta Fallon, and I'm going to be your host today. With me is Patrick Coué, who is an Artblog contributor and longtime Artblog advisor. Hello, Patrick.
Hey, Rebecca.
Patrick is going to be asking some questions and joining the conversation also. And we're very excited today to be speaking with Piotr Szyhalski. Piotr Szyhalski. Welcome, Piotr.
Thank you.
I'm
excited
so glad.
To be here.
Yeah, we're very excited also. Piotr's an artist and educator based in Minneapolis, whose large black and white posters based on handmade drawings that he made, they started popping up on walls around Philadelphia. Now, Piotr is based in Minneapolis. So first of all, what's the mystery of that? Why are they in Philadelphia? And while some of the posters they were wheat pasted on walls and other receptacles, and some have been scraped off the walls or covered up, others are still there and they broadcast messages. There's lots of words to read and very graphic images to see. So Piotr created this as part of his COVID-19 labor camp report project that started right as we started locking down in March for the pandemic. It's very pointed commentary, not for the faint at heart, and the imagery likewise, not for the faint at heart, and it's about the pandemic's mishandling, if in my interpretation, that's what it's about. So Piotr, these are posters from apparently the first 100 days of the lockdown, and
Right.
You made them daily. So talk about the germination of the project and what's going on now.
Well, the project actually at this point is completed. I have stopped making the daily drawings on November 3rd. Ever since the beginning of the project, the question when to end it or how many of those drawings I will be making, that was a big consideration initially, simply because in lockdown I only had so much materials, and so that was like a considered factor. Later it was, just how long can I possibly keep doing this? And then I started thinking about meaningful events or a sign, if you will, for when this thing might happen. And I realized at some point, maybe a couple of months into the project, that the furthest I was thinking about an ending point was the election. And as the months rolled by, it became more and more apparent that would be the right moment for the series to end, for a number of reasons. But to put it simply, I felt that we arrived at a kind of precipice or point of no return, and some big decisions will have to be made. And regardless of the outcome of those decisions, the project would have to change dramatically its scope, direction, tone. So it felt like the right moment. And based on the responses online, I feel like that was really the right moment for the project to end. So it is a complete set. There are 225 drawings in the series, and as far as germination and the sort of beginning of the project, as you said, it was started in the early days of the lockdown, and partly I would say as a kind of self-defense mechanism. Just wanting to do something with my hands or find a point of focus in otherwise chaotic or diffused reality. So
Great. Patrick, do you want to take over for a minute here?
Sure. Hi, Peter.
Hello.
A lot of your labor camp posters in Philadelphia have been affixed on USPS, relay boxes and boarded up stores, even dumpsters. So meaning like the greatest, fixtures of an American city. And I was wondering, what is the strategy behind that? And also, more generally using a city like Philadelphia, but also New York and Minneapolis and Baltimore as a support for social and responsible art.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can really say that there is a strategy. I think if there is something that feels like a strategy, is to simply trust um, the kind of organic dynamic that evolved around the project. When I started making the first drawings, well, first of all, I didn't even think of them as posters. That notion came out of me thinking about the appropriate means of visual communication that somehow reflected the subject matter that I was dealing with, which was this really rich, dense, complex political landscape. And so the language of poster as a kind of public space visual discourse platform became very obvious, and especially because in the early days of the pandemic, it was framed, at least in the US, as a kind of war on invisible enemy, we were told. And so the idea of looking at posters and intentionally drawing on historical references that bring to mind the vernacular of World War II posters and on from all over the world sort of became obvious to a degree and evident to me as the right kind of combination of visual means. So these things ended up looking like posters more and more as the series developed. And for a lot of people online, even though I was photographing my ink drawings, so about as sort of classic visual art form as you can get, people kept referring to them as prints because they just looked like printed matter. And so I think somebody online said, we should post these in public space, and that sort of caught on, and a lot of people ended up talking about this, and so, like I said, a kind of a trusting attitude about allowing the work to take its course led me to the opportunity to print some of these images on a larger scale. This is, my school, MCAD, was also on lockdown during the summer. And fortunately for me, the director of our sort of print center that we have, a service bureau at MCAD, was making weekly visits to the space to maintain the equipment. And we got to talking, and he said, yeah, I can make some scans and we'll see if we can get some prints done. And so that's how it started. And the work was presented in Rochester first on the inside of the gallery. And then I was approached by folks out of Baltimore with this idea of putting them in public space. And I immediately loved this concept because as much of a kind of lockdown interior social media existence as this project had, the idea of it becoming a public space experience was very, very attractive to me. And this is a whole separate issue. We can talk about the sort of appeal or importance of that. But the crew out of Baltimore, we discussed some strategies, I guess. After all, maybe there is a strategy there. Strategies about what to post and how. And so my notion was that to sort of flip it upside down a little bit. Typically, you have one design and you print it in a large quantity, and those posters sort of are present everywhere. In my case, it was singular print of each design, but many designs. So there is already a different dynamic at work as far as that public space and the language of poster and its presence is concerned. But I like thinking about it as sort of an exhibition, right, where you have these individual artworks distributed in a given area. And in Baltimore, these electrical boxes were like the perfect size to handle the 2x3 foot posters. I think there were 3x4 feet, so exactly kind of a same proportion thing. So that became the specific distribution approach. But and then once I started posting pictures from Baltimore, people from other cities reached out and said, we should do this in our city and in our city as well. And this is how it happened. This is how the project continued to evolve. Every aspect of it, whether it's the postcards or the book or the printed posters, and um, is essentially a kind of volunteer effort that is triggered by folks who engaged with the work online and felt somehow connected to it. And I feel there's a moment where the audience basically takes ownership of that work, and it plays a different role, I feel, because the agency of the audience is that is the factor that really give sort of reroutes the project in a slightly different direction. I'm always on the lookout for those opportunities, and really happy that this project had that kind of dynamic.
So you could almost call it viral transmission.
Interesting. Funny. It's not the first time somebody said that about this, because, in the context of the work that confronts a pandemic that is viral in its essence. Yeah, I'm not sure if work really truly attained this viral status by like online criteria, but I think you're right in the sense that people picked it up and redistributed. I mean, it's really hard not to talk about spreading, right?
This is such a good spread. It's like the antidote, which is great.
Right.
So I want to talk about Philadelphia, because Philly has been a hotbed of political activism for years now. Well, going back to 1776, as some people might say. And but you've been here before, and I think that's so interesting. You were at Tyler School of Art doing a project that was similarly wordy and printed, although no imagery. And then at Eastern State Penitentiary, you had a project that was quite different from this printed, hand-drawn sort of motif. So can you talk a little bit about your relationship to Philadelphia? Did you find a particular thing going on here that you could respond to?
Yeah, I guess first of all, I love the city. I've had a good fortune of visiting several times on account of the projects you mentioned. And did I find something? Yes, I think both of those projects were possible largely because of these amazing institutions that were connected to them, right? Let's see. Let me just briefly address the prison prison piece, which was a collaboration that I did with my friend Rich Shelton out of LA, and it is a very different formally work, but it was the prison itself that really was the point of attraction, because it is such an amazing historic place. And Rich and I both loved the fact that somehow it became a cultural institution, right? That it ended up housing these installation artworks in the unique cells. And both Rich and I have kind of a prison past, if you will. Both of my parents worked in prison at one time in their life. And I often say this in a cryptic way. I spend a good amount of time in a prison back in Poland. And when people hear this, they're like, their eyes pop out and like, oh yeah, what happened? And I spent a good amount of time in prison as a kid, because my mom was a prison nurse, and I just hung out with her at work. But that meant that the dynamic of that environment was somehow always, I don't know, part of the building blocks for me. And so anyway, when this opportunity presented itself, we both kind of were intrigued and ended up developing a project very much about the building, about the kind of the poetry embedded within the prison setting. But the reason why I wanted to dwell a little bit on this one is to say that my practice is very diverse formally, and each project, for me, part of the task is to understand the unique content that I'm dealing with and try to find the appropriate language to address or to kind of process that content. And so the formal language of the COVID series, like I was mentioning earlier, the idea of arriving at these posters that feel a little bit like wartime posters or some kind of propaganda vernacular, et cetera, is a sort of outcome of that questioning. What is the right language to talk about this? And and it was a different situation at Tyler, where I ended up presenting this massive piece that I called Them, and it's a project that is largely focusing on the economic inequalities in the country. And it was initially written, or the text was written in response to Occupy Wall Street protests. And it's a pretty intense project for me, and I think a big learning experience also. It's I'm not sure how much time we want to devote to this, but I will briefly say that that work too has an element of my own sort of expression and my own focus at processing our reality. And it's the them component, the banners that I print and then end up being walked outside of the gallery into the public space. So it sort of breaches that art institution space. But it also has this other leg where people send me requests for the texts of banners to print. I print them, and those banners become banners at the protests. And so the project, ever since I started doing this in 2015, has this dual life. On one hand, I execute my work, but at the same time, the actual printing apparatus, which is this massive thing that I have thousands and thousands of yards of this material that's 3 feet tall. And so I hand cut these letter forms that I print them one at a time. I must have printed thousands of characters at this point. I lost count because, that's been over 5 years now of this project. And the banners that people requested end up going to all different cities around the country. A little bit like what happened with the COVID series. And part of it is that there is that moment of ownership or agency that the audience sort of exercises over the work. And like I said, I look for these opportunities and I encourage them somehow as much as I can within the work too.
Very cool. Patrick, let's get to some of your questions.
I just wanted to go back to your audience, since again these series are in major cities, which again historically have been the breeding grounds for social movements against bigotry and for racial justice. I was wondering, you just mentioned that part of your work is collaborative. You're getting feedbacks from people. But so are you thinking about the audience of these big American cities, which are already, I think, convinced of the general message of these posters? And of course the slogans are so impactful. So I'm just wondering, who are you trying to reach besides, convinced audience by exhibiting in major American cities?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think somebody also asked me about, or maybe not asked about it, but suggested, these should go into decidedly different territory. And I don't disagree with that. The likelihood of finding volunteers in those areas to actually distribute the posters would be a different challenge. And again, this is what I meant when I said there's no strategy as far as like, I'm going to deal with this city, and this city. It happened that way because those were the cities that some folks simply reached out and said, we'll do it. We want to do it. And it still is happening. There's a set right now in Portland where the posters are being distributed there. So do I think about the audience and who I speak to? Absolutely. And with this project, it was, if it weren't for this sort of direct dialogical engagement of the audience, the project wouldn't have sustained. I wouldn't be able to sustain it for as long as I did. And it was really, actually, I would say, the amazing discovery of in how many different ways people were connecting with this work. And I am still not, I mean, I have some theories as to why that might have been the case, but it really is kind of astounding. And I try to save some of the comments or some of the feedback that I was receiving from the audience, because it was so, I don't know, in some ways just really beautiful too. Like simple things, but repeated multiple times by different people, such as the fact that it simply helps people feel sane, helps people understand that they're not alone in thinking this way about the situation, that there's somebody else that speaks to their sort of inner thoughts. Those are the things that are super humbling for an artist to hear, and incredibly motivating too, because I do think, and this is, I'm not sure how to talk about it in any other way, but somewhere along the way, maybe halfway into the project, 2-3 months into it, I really started to feel that my relationship to this work had changed, and that it wasn't just me putting up my work out there. I was tending to it. It was already its own thing, and the work just needed me to kind of tweak it every day a little bit, add this new thing that would calibrate or recalibrate the work as a whole a little bit, because new things happened and it needed to acknowledge the new developments in some ways. So I was sort of a maintenance person in this process. It's true. I mean, it was very, very clear to me, and there is a kind of ebb and flow to that dynamic, that relationship with the work. And I think if there's one constant element that I really felt strongly about, is that every day in the morning before I actually started drawing, I had to pause for a moment and really ask myself whether I am being 100% honest about what I am about to put out there. And that sense of like earnestness and I think an element of vulnerability that comes with that ultimately did translate, at least for some people, in the work, because that kind of exchange, that conversation that ensued, felt very true to me. And I mean, yeah, I can't tell you. So the amount of time that I put in to execute these pieces every day is one thing, but then the amount of time I actually spent talking to people about the work or about the issues that are surrounding it was a whole different ballgame. And after the nearly 8 months of the project, when I stopped, it was sort of like I don't know, like a hole opened up, like a void in the day, where I realized just how intensely this process took over my life. It was an incredible durational challenge.
It was labor.
Yes, it
and
was.
you working all the time. So let's get into that a little bit.
That's really funny. All right. Yeah.
You run your work under, I don't want to call it a brand, because
did you almost say that you run labor camp? I could hear that. That's great.
Well, you do run labor camp.
Yeah, sort of. Or it runs me. I don't know.
So talk about it, because it's a very interesting and philosophical rubric under which you are developing all your projects.
Yeah, it's strange. I use the word framework because it's a wonderfully flexible term. It could mean a lot of different things, but in a little bit like the idea of the labor camp that became this umbrella concept that initially, I want to say it started as a term that was maybe more directly focusing on my sound related work, which and that focused largely on work surrounding archival historical recordings from all over the world, different periods of history. And I was always intrigued and interested in working about what I would refer to as extreme historical phenomena, and events that happened some time ago, but their resonance seems to carry an impact on how we are today. So to sort of like give you a nutshell of the whole idea. And I was often thinking about that historical impact a little bit like the way the sound propagates in the air, through the particles in the air, kind of a push and pull dynamic. And I was thinking about, metaphorically, maybe about how that happens over time through history as well. And this process of really digging and researching and trying to piece something together from these fragments of the past, it was a little bit like, a little bit. I felt it was work. It was work that needed to be done. That there's something to be learned from that. That there's a point of value in doing this work. And labor camp as a historical concept, is in and of itself one of those extreme historical phenomena. And maybe we would like to think about it as historical phenomena. Of course, there's many labor camps right now in operation in different places around the world. So it's not kind of a distant thing. But that was actually part of my thinking about looking at these historical events, is to say they're not as sort of like safely deposited in the abyss of history as we'd like to think. And to be honest, the situation that we are finding ourselves in this country right now is the best illustration of that. I mean, who would have thought that we would be looking at the political landscape in the United States in the early 21st century and discussing it as almost carbon copy of the European landscape at the beginning of the 20th century. 100 years later, we appear to be, rehearsing this painful, complex, disturbing history from another context. And I don't know. It's as if though we haven't really learned much about where that took us. So these echoes, these repetitions, reverberations, resonances, I'm using intentionally this sort of like sonic terminology, because that was a big part of that early labor camp work that kind of blurred the distinction between sound and history. But then the labor camp framework moved, or I realized that it applied to my visual work as well, my printed matter. I print a lot of leaflets. Those are like by default connected to military and historical context. Everything suddenly seemed like was part of the labor camp. And my sort of joking response is, I think it might be running me, in the sense that I, at this point, feel that it would be very hard for me to produce new work that one way or the other would not feel like it's part of that framework. And, I think there's something about maybe the way I'm thinking about the work in general, which is sort of like a network of ideas. Each project the COVID project is an excellent example of that, because with 225 drawings, the internal references, external references, connections to other artifacts. It is truly a network of concepts and ideas. But I also look at my whole body of work in that way. There are numerous connections within this project that connect to other works. Not looking far, the Them project that I was talking about earlier, that it was executed at Tyler. There are direct links to that project within the COVID report projects. I can think of the top of my head, 3 separate drawings that use almost word for word phrasing from the Them project. I make these connections very intentionally so as to expand further that network of ideas. I think maybe it's somehow the idea of thinking of history as this massive network of interconnected concepts and ideas that maybe somehow saturated my thinking about the artwork in that way too. But one more thing I will say about this labor camp, because this could go on for a long time, but I'll say that when people ask me this question, partly because I think that we like to think about this as a kind of a distant concept. And I bring up examples of Facebook, for example, and say, we literally are working for Facebook nonstop. There's 24/7 new content that is being generated by the users of this platform. And ultimately, we're doing this work for free. We're doing this work that inflates the value of that platform. I did it too. The entire COVID project was present on Facebook and Instagram, right? It's the same company that essentially created that space that we are all occupying working. And one would say, oh, it's just me, tapping on the phone. I mean, like, that's true, but that's the difference between the 20th and 21st century, that what constitutes labor that produces value that then enriches the ruling class is very different. I love this term cognitariat, which is like a 21st century proletariat, right? That's so excuse me. So yes, it may seem as if though it's just fun and sharing pictures with our friends, but to me that's really easily the kind of situation that could be compared to a kind of a labor camp dynamic.
Patrick, do you want to ask Peter the question that you had about Instagram?
Sure. I mean, you partly answered it.
Right.
I was just thinking of that because so much of artist career, life, whatever, is mediated nowadays by Facebook and Instagram. Right. But you just talked about your ambivalence about using these platforms, and so it's been very much on your mind that and these are the companies which are highly criticized nowadays for creating kind of also political milieu we are dealing with.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's super complicated, and if we had the conversation 2 years ago and you would say, oh, you're actually going to be working on this massive project for months every day, and it'll be essentially an Instagram project, I would laugh because it just seems totally preposterous. But pandemic changed all of that, and I mean, it almost seems trite to say it, right? The world had been altered by this event, but it is true. I mean, I think that as far as extreme historical phenomena go, this is about as big as it gets. I mean, we're still in the midst of massive global tragedy, and again, one of the things that that was clear about this project to me is that people connected with it because we understood on some level a lot of these issues very, very deeply, without even speaking of these things out loud. So and it goes all the way from sort of the transparency of the political and social ugliness of it, all the way to these sort of foundational ideas or concepts of us collectively confronting our mortality, for example, right? And so I think that the project also had this real dynamic range, moments where it was very harsh and directly critical of the political space, but also reflecting on I don't know, the fact that spring had come and we are all locked up and the trees are blooming and the death is in the air, and being able to talk quietly about this as well. And so that's the in a way, a luxury of working on the work that has 225 components. I can afford to spend time lingering on something simple and quiet, and I can also find the time to scream about something that we all feel completely enraged by.
Wow. I think we should let it go at that. Those were wonderful words to end on, screaming in the dark while making gentle messages. I love it.
Right.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is Peter Szyhalski that we've been talking to about his COVID-19 labor camp project. Thanks so much. We are looking forward to seeing the book in print. There's a book
Yes.
coming. We'll have links in Artblog when we publish this to where you can find the book, where you can find out more about you and your work, your labor camp work. Patrick, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. Peter,
Thank
it's
you.
been such a pleasure. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for your work.
Thank you both for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And shout outs to Anna and all the cohorts in Philadelphia that made it possible.
Indeed. Thank you, Philadelphia. Okay.
Yes.